Chapter 11, Middle Adulthood. Welcome back. Nice to see you. I hope that all of you are doing well and hanging in there and everything. And today I hope you'll find this kind of interesting. We're really going to get into some of the social and emotional dynamics that affect this middle adult time period in life, right? So we're sort of looking at, for your note, you could kind of put like 40 to 65 if you want to date, but in general, just this period that's not early adulthood anymore. And we're not in kind of the retirement senior stage yet. We're in this middle period, right? And what are some of the kind of specific challenges and developmental goals associated with this stage? Welcome back. I hope grab a pen and some paper, and I hope you enjoy this. All right, let's get going. Before I get really going today, I wanted to make a quick point. I should have written out what I was going to say for this slide, but just what I was thinking is I'm always used to having way more interaction with students because, as you know probably by now, I've taught mainly at University of Waterloo and at Conestoga most of my career. And I know that this is like this remote delivery where I make the lectures and you watch the lectures and then write a test on it, and then we interact a little bit around assignments or whatever. But I just wanted to put it out there. I know my Conestoga students are struggling a bit now with like this, well, just the cold season. It's winter, deep in winter, which kind of brings out the blues sometimes for people in general, plus like just all the COVID stuff and just how that affects mental health and just stuff in general. And I just wanted to make a quick point that if people ever want to chat and just need to, I don't know, sometimes talking to someone that's not in your immediate world but sort of knows you and cares about you, like can be helpful. But then the other thing is if you need help specifically with like assignments, I would love to help with that too. And this is optional, no one needs to. And I don't have like office hours or anything. Obviously I live in Kitchener, but especially now that my daughter's back to school, like if anyone needs support, please just shoot me an email and we can set up like a quick Zoom meeting or phone call. I kind of do both with Conestoga students. Zoom works nice, but again, if you're more comfortable on the phone, I can call. I have good long distance, so I can call up to North Bay, no problem, or wherever you're living. So anyways, no pressure on anything, just I don't know. I like you students. The interactions I've had with you have been cool. I think that I just wanted to say, I know that this is, and I say this all the time, but it's to just keep saying, I know that this can be tough times, and if you don't have to go through things by yourself. Okay, and this kind of links to the topic for today, middle adulthood. When you get to the age I'm at, and quite literally, it's kind of I'm gonna try not to talk about this the whole time today, but this is an interesting presentation for me to do at this point in my life, and because I'm 39 right now, right? And so like I'm just about to enter theoretically this stage where you get a little bit more concerned with like, why are you doing the things you're doing? It's not as much about identity and intimacy now. Now it's more about, am I contributing anything? Am I contributing anything of value? Do these classes matter? Or is it just kind of like a paycheck and your credential? And there's nothing wrong with that aspect of the exchange, but it's like, I don't know, one of the reasons I even have a slide like this is because like I love the idea of, I don't know, maybe interacting in your life at a certain point and maybe nudging you a little bit in a direction towards being a little more sure in yourself, a little more confident, a little more focused. Because and again, like, keep in mind, my Conestoga program has much more of a developmental and career guidance counseling kind of focus. So I know that a lot of my students at Nipissing, you're in your second year, most of you in a like very focused career program, so I know that you know what you're wanting to do career-wise, but like, again, the complexity of this situation that we're all in psychologically and emotionally and socially, and yeah, I don't know. This is going to be the topic of today. This is like what Erickson would say. It's like, it's normal for me to struggle with this the same way it'd be normal for a teenager to struggle with identity, or a child with trust, or, you know, a young adult with intimacy. That Erickson would say, at this stage, I'm at this stage of generativity. Like, can I generate anything that matters? Is this all just kind of, you know, a flicker in the wind? Because Erickson would say, like, if you can't establish this feeling that, and don't worry, I have like specific definitions and everything coming, that if you can't establish that feeling, that what you're doing has like relevance and matters and has some kind of meaning to the next generation, that people can stagnate and feel like this like nihilistic like bitterness that things don't matter, right? And if you remember anything from me long term, remember this idea that I think like avoiding that psychological bitterness is one of your biggest challenges in life. It's taken down a lot of good people. All right, I didn't mean to do like a 6-minute rant on this slide, but you know, it's the relationship variable makes things more than transactional, in my opinion. And yeah, you're good people, you're cool people. It's like, I don't have to keep ranting about it. I'm just trying to say, if you need me, please reach out. So as we've moved through this course, we've been kind of using Erickson as this pivot point every week, as these key developmental stages. And as you remember, we've kind of went through like, you know, trust and autonomy and industry and initiative and identity and intimacy. It's tough to remember because so many of them have eyes, but yeah, I think I got those all in the right order. And it's like, his model does make sense. His model makes sense that there's these core things that are characteristic of that stage. And, you know, in some ways that's Erickson's legacy. That core idea that your psychology and your social world are intimately connected. And so this idea of generativity is, well, maybe just go all the way back to just what the word generate means. What does it mean to like generate something, to and you know, we also see the word generation there, right? It has this idea of like a creative aspect. It involves this interest in establishing and guiding the next generation, right? So this could be whether it's like raising your own kids, or helping support the young people in your family, or teaching or mentoring, or taking leadership roles in your community, and whether civically, like at a community level, or religious, or kind of charitable, or even political, right? And these ideas of like feeling a connection. Now remember, Erickson has this psychoanalytic background, so he's not just saying like, it's nice if you do this. He's saying this is essential to psychological stability. Right, and all the research would suggest that this is something that's like kind of highlighted here, but maintains importance through to old age. And this is what I went on that long rant about on the last slide. Do you feel like you're adding something of value? Right, and as you get older, you care more about that. You know, and you can probably think ahead that without totally telling you that, it's like, there's a good chance that the next project I give you will have something to do with this, and combined with the next idea of integrity, of like, if you know what you're going to care about when you're older, it should shape how you live now, right? And so starting to construct a life focused on healthy relationships, focused on doing things that are true to your focused goal, doing things that you'll be proud of later, is a good orientation, directional motive. And it's just a good way to live your life. I don't know why I'm trying to find like some fancy way of saying it. It's just like, I think the best way to live your life, this is obviously just my opinion, is to think about in 10 years, if you were looking back at yourself right now, how would you, looking back, want yourself to be living right now? And instead of trying to make some random society person or some random person in society or just society at large impressed, it's like, no, focus on like making your future self proud and watch things line up. It's like, anyways, I think that's key, because Erickson says that the threat of not doing this, it's like, and this is the thing, it's like we talk about intimacy and it just sounds all nice, but then it's like, well, wait a sec, because the profoundness comes from understanding the absolute devastation of it being gone, the devastation of isolation, the devastation of stagnation. Right, so check out this pond, right? So this pond is like, it looks gross. There's no clean water flowing into it or out of it. It looks like it's been sitting there for a long time. It looks like it's the green. It looks like it's just full of algae, right? It looks like there's probably mosquitoes. It's a stagnated pond. It doesn't look like it's, it's the opposite of like a flowing river in terms of water. And so that stagnated, Erickson would say, is like, that can also be experienced psychologically, that we can have these experiences of stagnation where failure can lead us to this sense of, well, that's a good way of saying it, personal impoverishment. It's like this deep lack of fulfillment, a lack of feeling like what you're doing matters to the next generation. And also, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in the next stage when we're talking about despair, but it's the beginning of this feeling of wishing it was different and not having time left to change it. And this goes back to what I was saying before of like, if you know what you're going to care about later, implement that knowledge. Again, I won't say this a million times, but I enjoy teaching this class. I hope that you get something out of this, and I'm going to try to just keep trying to talk about why we should care about this, why Erickson still has value, and why, understanding that development is something that's lifelong. And these last few chapters are kind of trying to express that point, that like adulthood itself is complex. It's not just childhood that's complex, and it's complex emotionally and socially, and how you see yourself and how you start to reflect on the life that you've lived, because you start to realize that it's finite. Yeah. Here's an awesome quote for you. Author Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, the great Sherlock Holmes. My mind rebels at stagnation. Give me problems. Give me work. Give me the most abstruse cryptogram, like word number puzzle, like think Sherlock Holmes, or the most intricate analysis, and I'm in my proper atmosphere. But I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave for mental exaltation. That's a really wordy way of saying, like, that stimulation, that feeling like things matter. I hate the dull routine of existence, but give me something to challenge me, something. And we're going to see this moving forward, this idea of like resisting stagnation, psychologically, emotionally, physically, socially, as core to successful aging through this stage. So one thing that Erickson was interested in, and think about this for a sec, that how much, so this was actually pretty interesting because it was research done with, focused on the man in the relationship, when in a lot of times studies looking at parenting are focused on mom. But in this study, it was looking at couples where the man didn't have the child and how it affected psychological health later. And what they found was actually quite interesting. It was like the variable was totally dependent on how much it was valued. So for men that didn't want to have kids and it wasn't a big deal to them, it didn't have a huge effect on their psychological health later. But for men that did, when there were men that scored how much they wanted to have kids really high and they didn't have kids, it seemed to have a huge effect on psychological health at 47. So that means like kind of how someone responds earlier to it. So whether it's devastating or whether it's not devastating, I guess, right? The severity of how devastating that is, or whether it even is, because right, if someone doesn't want to have kids, then not having kids isn't devastating at all. But how they respond to that is actually predictive. It's an important variable in predicting their overall psychological health, like at 47, like later, right, when they're deep into that middle adulthood stage. And there's also a lot of research that suggests this idea that raising a kid or another child may actually bring forth. So what I mean by that is like maybe it's your own kid, or maybe it's like helping with like the young kids in your family, extended family, right? Or maybe it's through teaching, or maybe it's through like kind of being involved in, again, remember this generative process, this engagement with the upcoming generations, right? In the kind of most intense ways with parenting, and then also with like contributing to child and youth development in general. And that engaging in that kind of stuff seems to put you in a remember Erickson, in a psychosocial situation that seems to bring forth, call forth nurturing qualities that may have this important influence on psychological growth. Right? And a lot of people that are parents, and it almost sounds like a broken record, but I'd say it, like having a kid changed who I was. It like immediately, it's hard to even say how. Right? But it's just an interesting finding that he noticed when he was researching this, is that it almost seems like it brings forth something else. And you know, Erickson, like, it's the interesting question then is like, what do you mean brings forth? Do you mean genetics? Right? Because brings forth, it's kind of interesting how the language is there, right? Because if it's saying it brings forth these qualities, that's like the opposite of saying that those qualities are learned. So it's pretty interesting if you really take the depth of what he's saying there. He's almost talking about a behavioral genetics. More recently, a researcher named George Vallot, who's actually from Harvard, you can find he did a TED Talk when he was like 86. I was actually just rewatching it again because I was thinking about including it, but it's like 20 something minutes and it's a little bit slow, but so I'm not going to include it straight in this video. But I would recommend, if you're interested, it's slower paced, but he tells the TED Talk in a really interesting way. Like, you know how most people do TED Talks, like a presentation basically with PowerPoint, and they're really focused and kind of hard hitting. He does it as in kind of a story, so it was kind of cool. But the reason I wanted to bring him up is because he had this idea that you could almost have subsections within this developmental stage, or sub-developmental tasks, and two key ones, right? And so the first one he referred to is this idea of career consolidation. Think of what consolidation means, to bring together and to make solid, to consolidate. You see the word solid right in there, right? And to kind of establish and the idea here is that when you're in this like kind of 40 to 65 range or whatever, and obviously like those age ranges are just a template, that, well, it's the kind of the heart of your career, and when establishing that career-based social network is important in generating satisfaction with work-related choices, people tend to enjoy their careers more, or if they haven't gotten themselves into a job they like, again, this stagnation variable. It's like it's really important for at your age to be thinking about this. It's like, how do you set yourself up for a situation that's going to be psychologically rewarding for you later? And it's like, be around people that are healthy and be healthy, and engage in things that you find meaningful, right? And in terms of career, like, so this was one of the things, like, one of basically all Valent's saying is that we need to split this idea of generativity into career and family, right? So in career, the idea is career consolidation, right? So on the test, it might ask you, like, what are the two ideas of Valant, whatever. Career consolidation is one, and then the next one's related to family. Right, so the next one then is this idea of keeper of meaning. So, yeah, how do you like that picture? That's me and my mother-in-law, actually, like maybe 2 summers ago. But the reason I have a picture of her is like, she's the type of person that will like host the Christmas party and make sure that we celebrate everybody's birthday, and tell stories about back in the day. And it's like, she's the keeper of meaning in that social setting or in that family, right? And so one of Erikson's ideas, or one of Valant's ideas as an expansion of Erikson, is that an extra part of this kind of mid-adulthood is balancing this career consolidation and being keepers of meaning. And sometimes that's at like a family level, but actually, come to think of it, sometimes it's also in other ways. Like, for example, I've been teaching this Human Services Foundations program at Conestoga College, I don't know, maybe 10 years now. And so like now there's like some new teachers in the program and stuff, and it's like sharing some of this ideas with them, and then eventually they'll be sharing it with like the new people when I'm gone. And it's like, people call that like institutional memory, but that kind of stuff exists like institutionally, but it also exhibits like in like within youth sports, or within religious organizations, or within musical organizations, or within whatever your hobbies are, with whatever social worlds you engage. The ability to maintain institutional memory is, well, core to human civilization, right? And certain people play those roles more. Yeah, so anyway, so these ideas of like career consolidations and keepers of meaning as core psychosocial developmental tasks, they're being presented as these like kind of nuanced sub-stages of Erikson's generative theory. Yeah, it's a decent idea, pretty solid contribution by Valant. Right now, I'll just share this quick, just like, I'm just trying to be a little personal. So it's like the good-looking guy with the plate. He's yours truly. My wife's got the green shirt, but it's like, this is from the same trip as the picture where I was just swimming with my mother-in-law. It's like doing stuff like this every year and getting everybody together and telling stories and keeping meaning is again, key to psychological and social experience. It's interesting, right? Because this course is kind of about this idea that you value and you view and you engage with things differently as you age. And that's both like a kind of simple point and an incredibly deep, hard to explain point at the same time. Because it manifests in such a multitude of subjective and objective ways in how we engage things, in how we perceive things, in how we weigh things philosophically. And we're getting more philosophical at this stage, and we're caring about different variables, right? So in like movies and stuff, you see this idea a lot, like this idea of midlife crises, or like and it's kind of interesting, this idea of what I have there, like you start to realize that you're mortal, that eventually you'll have an end date, that you start, and often that's because of physical limitations, or finding out that you have an illness, or that you're really hurting your back, or maybe losing like a close friend, or maybe losing all these, maybe losing a spouse, all these things that are reminders of mortality, and beginning to accept that and beginning to recognize that like you're not as young anymore. And sometimes that's through physical limitations, and sometimes it's adapting to major changes, maybe going through a breakup, or maybe becoming a parent, or becoming a grandparent. Right, so Levinston, we haven't touched on too much, but we will. This idea that each person needs to confront a constellation of difficult tasks in mid-adulthood. Right, in constellation, think of like a constellation of stars, like all the stars. It's like there's a bunch of things going on. It's like not just one thing, and so it's not just that like you get to a certain age and you hit 45 and it's like midlife crisis, boom, and it's like it's not triggered that way, but the likelihood of having this moment, because right, combine these points with what I was just saying about that as you get older, there's this natural tendency to become more reflective, to become more, and then to also focus on this generativity factor. So more philosophically reflective, more caring about if what you did mattered, more noticing that there's mortality. That's normal to the human experience. It's not some like age triggered crisis, but the fact that there's this increased focus on if things matter or not. Because think about it, that's kind of the idea of the midlife crisis, is like, because what if your answer to is what you're doing matter? Does what you're doing matter? What if your answer to that is no? Right, and then what do you do? So the research on this is like there's no like age triggered commonality or common midlife crisis, but the fact that people deal with all this stuff, and it's married to this reflective period focused on if what you did mattered, means that a lot of people go through this experience psychologically and emotionally. Yeah, so the research basically says it's not age triggered, but it's lifetime triggered. Like it's not tied to any specific chronological age, which you would assume when you kind of just actually think about it. But there's something there. There's a reason why so many movies are about it and things are about it, and it's part of people's experience. They realize that they're getting older and that they're not 18, 19, 20, where it seems like you can kind of go in a lot of different directions. Those different directions start to close down a little bit, right? So that's kind of the point here. Right, so I should have this slide up while I was making that last point, because when you look at the research, what they find is that this is kind of the second one there, that a lot of what people experience is really kind of more attributed to the complexity of adulthood than to a specifically triggered like midlife crisis that everyone goes through as a specific developmental stage. So it's not like the idea that serious midlife problems are experienced by probably about a quarter of people they report, but still a quarter of people, that's a lot, right? But the idea that it's most likely being triggered by things like life events, and that makes sense, like divorce or losing a parent, or severe physical challenges like learning of a disease or something, right? Midlife does present a lot of physical challenges. Now, here's an important point, and this is the Viktor Frankl point, that how you view your life story actually affects longevity. Remember, that's like Viktor Frankl's massive contribution to psychology, is this idea that living a life with purpose and psychologically feeling engaged in a meaningful way with your experience is related to longevity. And remember, he developed those ideas while in Auschwitz, watching who was, well, using applied meaning to achieve longevity within, the worst of the worst style of situations. Yeah, so at the end of the last week's presentation, I had like a clip about Viktor Frankl. Yeah, so again, it's interesting how something that you would think of as like a psychological thought would affect something like longevity, but it's this idea of like, we can say the opposite, that being negative all the time and having that increased amount of cortisol in your system all the time has a degenerative effect, right? So this is just sort of saying the opposite. New transition, right? Was the vortex turning it all into little particles. I thought that might be getting a little old. It's like cool for a few, right? I'll go something more basic. But yeah, each of us are occupying all these different roles and playing multiple roles throughout our lives. And in psychology, they use these two terms to represent aspects of it. And the first one is role strain. Okay, so if you can have this is talking about the strain. Like, think of strain as like the tension on a rope if in a tug of war. The strain is that tension. It's like the strain that's put on us by a specific role, right? Like, so when, for example, your role as a student during exam week, it's like what's stressing you in that situation is the demands of that specific role, right? Because we're going to contrast it in a second with role conflict, where it's like tension between these roles, like being a parent and an employee, right? That's a classic one, right? Your kid has to be at school, but you got to be at work, and it's like, that's role conflict. Role strain is when it's within the role. Like, work is stressing you out, school is stressing you out. Stress that occurs when a person lacks the resources needed to fulfill a role. Right, and it can be anxiety provoking. Definitely, right? So the point that I want you to know in relation to the test is the idea that role strain is within one role, and then role conflict is between roles. Okay, so then role conflict, any situation in which two or more roles are at least partially incompatible. Right, like you see the lady running there with like holding one kid, holding another kid. Her purse is there. It's like you see the clock representing like time concern, the laptop, work, plus like the meals for the day. There's like a schedule there. There's the kids' toys. I just thought that picture was like pretty good at representing this idea of like the strain, the pressure of trying to do it all at once. And notice how it's not any of the one things, it's the combination. For example, simultaneously caring for teenage children and aging parents. We're going to talk about that specific scenario a bit today and talk about this is called the sandwich generation, right? When people are supporting both parents and children. But yeah, role conflict and role strain. Strain within one role, conflict, the interaction between the roles. So as we're in this middle adulthood stage, it's interesting to note that we see the highest scores in terms of things like marital stability and satisfaction. And the word of the day in relation to this is this term skilled diplomacy. And think about what that basically means. It means like, well, in simple language, it means being with someone for a long time and learning how to work through things, learning how to have difficult conversations, learning how to address problems, learning how to do it in a way that is knowledgeable of the other person. Right? And that's going to mean something different in every relationship, and that's skilled diplomacy. It's like advanced problem solving that's incredibly situationally based, that's done to maintain and develop the quality of the kind of depth of the relationship. It's a pretty awesome way of looking at it, that one of the main, because I made this point earlier that in the course that like one of the main things associated with long-term success in relationship is the ability to handle the things that come up, over time. This increased identification of successful problem-solving strategies, right? Which is just, as we all know, just like a fancier way of saying what I'm sort of saying, like just learning the other person, learning yourself, learning the interaction of the two of you, and then learning what makes sense to do in certain situations and not going down the same path a million times if it's not successful, and successful problem solving strategies, not just problem solving strategies. Increased sense of control. So you see this like overall, you see the word like increased sense of control, and you see the word stability up there, like this overall kind of, in some ways it's the most stable time in your life, right? You're not a kid anymore, you're not a young adult, you're kind of in this, mid-adulthood. Less conflict over child raising, right? Maybe the kids are older. Yeah, so it's interesting to see that this is where we see the marital stability and the marital satisfaction really increases in old age significantly, and that's like kind of an untold story of relationships, is like some of the best parts is down the road, and it's why the development of that skilled diplomacy stuff is so key, so that it doesn't break down over something like that because of too much like hot cognition, right? All right, next slide. So here's this sandwich generation idea that in middle adulthood, the family role involves giving assistance in both directions, right? So maybe I can see, my mom is doing it right now. So like, say my mom's like helping with her dad, who I'm going to focus a little bit on in next week's presentation. But helping support him, and then at the same time, like, helping with my daughter a bit, like, especially like pre-COVID and stuff, right? But think about that she's like kind of trying to, and still, like, she's still working. And it's like, maybe when my mom, if my, like, God forbid, but if my mom gets sick, like, in the future, it's like, and I'm trying to help her and raise Evie, and, you know, I mentioned this, but we have another one on the way, so it's like, that would be an example of this sandwich generation idea. Supporting grown or helping grown children, or even young children, like, it depends on the age range, right? But just basically this idea of giving support financially, attention-wise, and time-wise, energy-wise, in both directions, right? The guy there kind of has like the stroller in one hand, and, you know, you kind of would assume like his dad in a wheelchair in the other hand, kind of just representing this idea of a two-sided situation, a situation where on both sides you're giving more support, attention, all that stuff I just said, than you're receiving. Giving assistance in both directions of the generational change. I should have just said it like that. That's way cleaner. But it's an interesting stage that a lot of people experience. So, can you have the second point for your notes? Like, I'll say the first part, but part of the sandwich generation is this idea of needing to shoulder responsibility for maintaining the bonds in kind of both directions, right? Like, just use my mom's example again, like, worrying about my daughter and how her school is going, and also like worrying about her dad, but then like also having her own job, and then also like being married and having other kids, and it's like that there's some strain with that, and you can see in this picture it's represented pretty good. You can see how they use the word sandwich, right? That it's like you're in the middle. Obviously, I've said that a couple times now, but it's just sometimes nice to see it graphically. But yeah, the point that between 40 and 65, adults give more help than they receive in both directions. The sandwich generation.
Around the world, people are feeling the squeeze. Global trends such as longer lifespans and decisions around when to start a family mean that there is a growing number of adults who are simultaneously caring for their children and their parents. They've become the sandwich generation. Anyone who's working and a member of the sandwich generation is going to be under a lot of pressure. The costs involved in raising a family and looking after your parents could force you to dip into your savings, take more time off work, and increase your stress levels. This has a knock-on effect on employers. A stressed sandwich generation worker can mean unexpected absence, health problems, poor engagement, and a hit to productivity. It could even lead to higher staff turnover. Some employers have already begun to tackle the problem and are looking at new ways to adapt, especially as more and more people join the sandwich generation and employee expectations shift. Employers that respond with empathy and flexibility can reduce turnover, improve productivity, and more deeply engage their people without disruption to the bottom line. The sandwich generation faces unique challenges and stresses, but strategies to support their needs can mitigate the impact. The result can be a healthy, confident, and engaged workforce that thrives on balance.
In middle adulthood, the total number of friends tends to be less than earlier in life, but those friendships tend to be more intimate and close and tend to endure. Like, endure over time, right? So endure means this time component, which is a really interesting thing, and you know, I include there a picture of me with some of my buddies when we went for like one of them were getting married, so we went to have like a weekend, this like wilderness outdoor place where there was zip lining and stuff, and it's like all those guys are people that like I could not see for a year or something like that, and run into and hang out with all weekend and have a great time. Right? I grew up playing sports with all those guys, and it's like those friendships maintain over time. Everybody knows everybody else is busy. So it's just a different kind of situation. But it's interesting to know that like the research on it's actually quite clear that although the total number of friends tends to go down, the quality and the depth increase, in some ways accounts for that. And then this idea that friendships tend to endure even with less contact, and it's because, everybody understands that everybody else is doing their life, and it's like, but those relational bases exist. Foundations, or bases exist. And so, it's an important thing that the social world's maybe a bit smaller, but it's of high quality. So another potential dynamic at this life stage is this idea of, it's sometimes referred to as emptying the nest, or like when you've had children, when parents have had children, and then they move out of the house. And the research that was talked about in the literature about this is actually quite interesting, because although we usually would talk about this as like a negative psychological experience, like emptying the nest is like traumatic because of you miss them so much and all that kind of stuff, and it's like, and parents obviously do, but it's interesting that when women are asked about how that transition affects their life, it tends to be described as a positive thing. And that's not that they don't miss the kids, it's that, maybe it's the increased independence, maybe it's whatever, more time to focus on themselves. But then there's this, can you have this term too, this idea of this boomerang generation, or this adolescence, which is obviously just the combination of the word adolescence and adult, where kids are going back home again after moving out initially. And to be honest, that might include a lot of you right now because of all this pandemic stuff and just going to school in general, and there's nothing wrong with that. And actually, if you're living at home during all this, it makes a ton of sense in a way too, right? And it's like, but even before COVID, we saw this is like a new trend across the board, which is kind of like why in the recent presentation I was talking about this idea of emerging adulthood, right? But when we were talking about emerging adulthood, we were talking about it from the perspective of like the 20-year-old. Now we're talking about this dynamic from the perspective of like perhaps the 60-year-old parent, right? And although they might love having the kid back home, there could be stress associated with it. Some of it might be space, some of it might be financial, right? Some of it might be some different dynamics or whatever. So it's just an interesting, again, psychological, social dynamic to consider. So there's new roles that also, I'm just kind of going to hit a few more ideas, right? This presentation is going to be a tiny bit shorter, but I have a few more ideas that I want to touch on. I want to talk about grandparenting, and then I want to talk about Alzheimer's for a bit. And then the next presentation I do, because I know you all have the next week is like your study week, and then, or like student success week, or I forget what it's called at Nipissing. But then I'll do the last chapter, or sorry, like the last age-related chapter, which is chapter 12, which we're going to be looking at late adulthood, and then we're going to be looking at death and dying, and then some of those like things I'm calling special presentations near the end. So we're kind of getting to this point where we're already at the grandparenting stage of the life cycle, right? And now we're going to be dealing with a lot of this like reflective aspect of making sense of it all too, right? So I hope that you find this, like how I try to conclude this content, interesting, because this is interesting because a lot of grandparents report this as a really high level satisfaction role and something that they get a lot of emotional and psychological meaning from. Grandparents also can have a very positive influence on the grandchildren, so it's a bi-directional benefit, right? Like, for example, I'm going to show in a second, but like my mom helping with, like, for example, my daughter my mom loves that and my daughter loves that, and it's like good for both of them. So it's like it has this high level of emotional, psychological benefit for the grandparent, and then just like the full spectrum of benefit for the kid, for both really. Right? It's especially important in situations where the child might lack stability for other reasons, right? Maybe there's some chaos in the family, or maybe it's a single parent situation where the grandparents are playing like an additional support role, and those can be that can be super important for a child's development. Yes, we're going to talk about this idea of grandparenting for a few slides. So here's a picture of my mom when she was going through her treatments, and the reason I wanted to include this is to just tell a really quick story that I think one of the things that really helped my mom when she was going through her chemo for breast cancer was that my sister had her first child, Bennett, who you see there, who was like the first grandchild in our family. There's 5 now, the 6th on the way, but Bennett was the first. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I think my mom at that time was going through the treatments, as I was saying, and like kind of viewing herself as, it's easy to get into a mindset of viewing yourself as almost like the patient, and then having a grandkid, viewing yourself as a grandparent, it's a very different psychological identity. And I saw like it on her have a therapeutic effect. Right? So the depth, I'm just using this to kind of make this point, that the depth of this intergenerational connection and their ability to provide deep value and right, I don't know, I just think it's just really interesting, because I'd almost go as far as to say it was like almost like some kind of therapeutic change in self-concept created by this addition of a new role, right? To use just the language that we've been using today. So yeah, I don't know, just thought that'd be maybe an interesting example. So 29%, so let's just get a few kind of points down. We're just going to talk about kind of different styles of grandparenting in the sense of the different ways it kind of exists. And we'd say about like 30% of grandparent relationships are what we would call remote. So situations where they see their grandchildren relatively infrequently. Usually it's for reasons related to physical distance, right? And so the impact on development is obviously less because of the reduced frequency of engagement. So what we're going to kind of be talking about over the next couple slides is this kind of range in how involved grandparents are in the kid's life, right? So remember, we're looking at this from the perspective of the grandparent. Because we're at that age range, some of the grandparents are involved kind of remotely in the grandchildren's life. Most common reason cited is this physical distance, right? Just not, this is most common if like they like literally live maybe in different countries or other sides of the country, or even just far away in the same city. So about half of grandparents report having what we would call like a companion relationship. So we're going to define these as ones that are warm and pleasurable relationships, basically meaning scenarios where there's emotional warmth, there's good communication, they enjoy being around each other, but also it's kind of nice to not have the duties associated with kind of the day-to-day responsibilities of raising kids. Right? Maybe the grandparents even take care of the kids for the weekend or whatever. Right? And so notice how we're going to be getting more and more involved here. Like quite literally. So the next category is what we'd call involved. 16% report involved relationships where they're engaged with the kid, sometimes up to every single day. maybe even living in the same house, maybe providing nearly full-time care. So then the next one it's gonna be basically full-time, right? So we went from little contact to companion contact to involved to now we're gonna go to the next level. So then just to finish this thought, in the literature they use this word custodial grandparenting, right? So that means like, custodial means like that they're actually responsible for the well-being of the child, whether legally or not. But when the grandparents providing full-time custodial grandparenting, usually when the mother's unmarried, maybe the daughter's going back to school or working or something's going on. Maybe it's in a negative way, that mom's struggling with something and trying to get it figured out, and grandparents are taking care of the kid for the time or whatever. Yeah, it's when you ask people, it's interesting because that second point, just to give it context, it was talking about this idea that like when you ask people to talk about their grandmas, or when you ask them to talk about their grandpas, the way they talk about their grandmas is often a fuller, bigger story that involves more things and more levels of dynamics of the emotional relationship. Not all the time, obviously, but when you ask people to define those roles, the role of grandmother is often defined more broadly. For most adults in middle age, this is an interesting point too, that for most adults in middle age, it's like being a grandparent's not the central thing in their life. I had this weird experience once when my grandma, who's my mom's mom, who was like one of my favorite people, when she passed away, and I like remember seeing in her yearbook it had said something about like how she was awesome at basketball, or some comment that was like about how she dribbled, or like something about like referring to basketball skill. And I remember being like, what? Like I had no idea my grandma even played basketball. I'm feeling deja vu, like I've told you this story before, but it was like this interesting scenario of, to me, she was always like this older lady that was my grandma, and you don't think of this idea that to her she's having her own whole experience, right? And that role of grandparent isn't the only part of their identity, or sense of self is the word I use here. It might be a big part of it, but it's kind of an interesting thought. And not in a bad way either. It's like, that's in a good way. It's just talking about this idea that people are dynamic, and even though the grandparent role is really important and maybe really engaged and really fulfilling and all this, it's like they also want to experience their self and their dreams. So I just want to spend a minute on this point and link this with this concept of caregiver burden. And caregiver burden refers to this idea of like how, well, just kind of the stress and strain and emotion of supporting others in general. That adults can feel this strong sense of filial responsibility, or this kind of felt obligation and responsibility to support and take care of their parents, right? And that when parents need help, that the children are trying to provide that, and that can be challenging in supporting these elders and stuff, and that the caregivers report having effect. So like, think of those two effects, depression and lowered marital satisfaction. So if you really think of what that's saying. Oh, so sorry, I skipped over the second point about elders there. This idea that in societies where they talk about the older people more like elders, and I would argue that talking about people like elders is very different than as like seniors, for example, right? Like there's almost just more respect with the idea of elders, and this kind of traditional idea of having them more involved with the kids' development, and basically this idea of, in cultures where the elders are valued differently, this idea of filial responsibility is stronger. That's you could make that as one of a critique of the culture here in North America, is like we don't always do a great job of finding meaningful ways to engage our old. Right, that's kind of a whole other topic, but caregivers report more depression and less marital satisfaction. Oh yeah, I was going to make this point that, like, notice how one of those is at like the kind of individual psychology level and the other one's at like the couple psychology level, right? And it makes complete sense because they're just drained and tired all the time. So it's like it's hard to be like drained and tired and then go home and have like then prepare like a super romantic, fancy, ton of work meal or something, romantic dinner. It's like you can easily see how it's related to relationship dissatisfaction, right? So one of the challenges then is to be aware of that potential and address it head on, right? Which is why support groups and stuff like that can be really helpful in this specific situation, because for a lot of people dealing with caregiver burden, hearing other people talk about similar situations actually has like a bit of a normalizing effect, and they can talk about resources and stuff. So, some things work better with different types of techniques, and support groups tend to work really well with caregiver burden because of the relatability and the ability to share resources.
Over a century ago, a German doctor called Alois Alzheimer spotted anomalies in brain sections from a patient with dementia. Ever since, people have been studying the strange plaques and tangles that he saw, in the hope that we could one day understand and cure what is now known as Alzheimer's disease. Plaques are insoluble deposits of a peptide called amyloid beta, or A-beta. They're formed when a protein called amyloid precursor protein is sequentially cleaved by two enzymes, beta and gamma secretase. Other molecules are generated by this cleavage and may play a role in the disease, but A-beta is the main culprit. A-beta tends to misfold and become sticky, eventually clumping together to form soluble oligomers. Some of these aggregate into large insoluble fibrils that deposit in the brain as plaques. The oligomers come in several forms or species. We don't know exactly which species are toxic, but research shows that they weaken communication and plasticity at synapses. This could be what stops the brain from forming or retrieving memories. Neurons aren't the only cells affected in Alzheimer's disease. Astrocytes and microglia also play a role. Microglia are immune cells that clear out waste and prune synapses during development. Microglia take up A-beta, but they also get activated by it, triggering the release of inflammatory cytokines that can damage neurons. The microglia also start to remove synapses by phagocytosis. As synapses start to malfunction and neurons die, abnormal patterns of activity emerge, and eventually, the brain can't process and store information properly. Another key feature of Alzheimer's disease is neurodegeneration. Neuronal death and damage is triggered by A-beta, but some of A-beta's effects seem to be mediated by another protein seen in the brains of patients, tau, a component of tangles. In a healthy neuron, molecules are carried along the axon on a series of tracks, made of microtubules and stabilised by tau. But in Alzheimer's disease, tau is modified, causing it to dissociate from the microtubules, adopt an abnormal shape, and move from the axon to the cell body. Like A-beta, tau comes in a variety of forms, and we don't know which ones contribute to the disease. And like A-beta, these forms either remain soluble or stick together and deposit as the tangles that Dr. Alzheimer saw. Eventually, these processes kill the neuron. Another problem, seen in animal models, is that misfolded tau proteins can spread across synapses into healthy neurons. There, they make healthy tau proteins start to misfold as well, spreading pathology across the brain. The pattern of spreading through the different brain regions matches the changing symptoms from early to late stages of Alzheimer's disease. This pattern also reflects how certain neurons are more vulnerable than others to dying. Despite these advances in our understanding of Alzheimer's disease, no cure exists. While drugs are being developed to target amyloid beta or tau, it's unclear whether they will eventually be successful in treating the disease. There's only one certainty. Continued support for basic and clinical research will enable us, one day, to diagnose and treat this devastating condition.